ladies and gentlemen, let's set the record straight because that is the name of our next session. Let's quickly get cracking on it. India, the world's largest democracy with a rich multicultural society that has long prided itself on the peaceful transfer of power. Now, it is one of the fastest growing economies and with a consequential global footprint, but despite significant economic growth, India's narrative often gets lost on the global stage. How do we reclaim that very narrative? And why does the global perspective diverge from India? Today, we are set to discuss how India can restore an accurate depiction of its own achievements and why conflicting political opinions are seen as divisive rather than an indication of a healthy democracy, and question how majority view are sometimes misconstrued as majoritarianism. Let's set the record straight, ladies and gentlemen. Joining us for setting the record straight, may I please call upon stage, ladies and gentlemen. Give it up for Salvatore Babones, sociologist and author, associate professor at the University of Sydney. Also joining him would be Vikram Sampath, historian and author. And give it up, ladies and gentlemen, for Salman Khurshid, former Minister of External Affairs of India. Thank you, sir. Mili Ashwarya, senior VP and publisher, Penguin Random House India, is also going to be gracing us for this very event. And lastly, requesting TV9 Network's Karthikeya Sharma to please take over the proceedings of the floor.
A very warm welcome to all of you. I think Kabir has done a fabulous job, sir, in framing the debate. But there'll be three parts to it. I know there's a paucity of time, but I'll quickly take you through it. The first part will deal with the contours of imagining Indian developments. For example, the Kashmir story in the Western narrative after revocation of Article 370 became a story of suppression, rights issues. It was never seen from the perspective of, say, empowerment or integration. The second part would be a lot of newspapers, journals, countries blamed India for being neutral, not India first. When we said it's strategic autonomy, Europe's war is not India's war. The third part would be on COVID, Ayodhya. But I would like to start this conversation with former External Affairs Minister, former Law Minister, Salman Khurshid. So how do we wrest back the Indian narrative? India, as I said, was accused of cozying up to Russia, whereas there was no question asked to the German investment in China, where the entire East Europe was high on the Russian gas, but we were being seen as neutral, financing a dictator in Moscow. How do we address that?
Well, look, somebody controls the narrative in the world, and someone has controlled the narrative in this country as well. It's inevitable, perhaps it's inevitable, that narratives get controlled, and there are people who bring in counter-narratives, and the counter-narratives compete for space. And if you're a sensible liberal society, then you accommodate everybody. And I think that that's what India has prided itself in. Of course, the competition between narratives, and there are many narratives, but let's say a couple of dominant narratives, the competition between them has become very intense and politicized, because that narrative doesn't stop at the narrative. It has consequences and implications which are of a political nature. Now, a narrative must always have a purpose, and that purpose is a social, political, intellectual purpose the narrative has. But when it becomes dominated by politics, and I use the word politics in the narrowest sense, politics is a good thing to do. People think politics is a bad thing to do. But if you make politics very narrow, which is often described as party politics, then, of course, you lose the value of the narrative. Now, we've had a global narrative, and I believe I have no compunction and I have no hesitation in saying that the global narrative is getting vastly influenced by what India feels and says today. And there are obviously wonderful articulations of it. We may not agree with all of it as a political party, as a group of people in this country, but the narrative is being heard across the world. Now, when will, if you like, a narrative of the past that gave us a particular picture, when will that picture transform and change will depend on how sustainable the new narrative is. The trouble is, and I'll end with this, the trouble is that that narrative that's gone abroad was a narrative that seemed to be based on consensus in the past, but it is not based on consensus today. There are essential differences in one's perception between large groups of people in this country, and that transmits itself abroad as well. So inevitably, if I go abroad and somebody is to ask me about specifics of an attitude that is traveling from India abroad, I can't just simply say I agree with it, because we have disagreements. And I think the big challenge for us is, how does the new narrative accommodate differences and differences of opinion? And that's important, because as a democracy, we must know how to deal with our differences.
Mr. Khurshid, is narrative a function of hard power, or is it a function of a soft power? Or is it completely correlates with the rising economy?
No, economy has a very important role to play. We think that we have many attributes of our civilization and our culture that play a role, and it's wonderful that they play a role. Americans play a role. The British have played a role. No sex, please, we are British, etc. That's played a role, and this Nirat Chaudhary will tell you. But the fact remains that economic power and military power are important dimensions of any narrative. But a narrative doesn't have to depend on them. Now, today we have a very important economic power presence. We have a growing military power presence. But I think that we should not be dependent only on them. We should reach out to what you might call soft narrative or soft power perceptions or projections, etc. But essentially, what do we do with, if we disagree intensely at home, what do we do with it abroad? Can we agree to disagree so that at least abroad we can agree on everything or seemingly agree on everything? Are big questions that the top leaders in this country, both in terms of intellect and in terms of political power, have to decide.
Okay, I understand. And I think in 1990s, if I remember it correctly, there was a delegation which was led by Atal Bihari Vajpayee, and you were steering it when Narasimha Rao was the Prime Minister. But it brings me to another very important aspect which you raised. Vikram, do you think that there is an internal displacement, as Mr. Khurshid was talking about, a shift of the Nehruvian consensus in last 10 years of Modi's tenure? A parallel, alternative, or a competing narrative?
Thank you, Kartikeya, and such a great pleasure to share the stage with all eminent people, especially my dear friend, Mr. Khurshid, whom we have always had very healthy debates with. I think the fight today is constantly this, at least on the cultural side. And to a large extent, I believe that it's the culture and the civilization which then defines the hard power. First, you need to have that sense of rootedness to your identity, to where you come from, your civilization, and then you go external and you're able to conquer newer vistas. So there, I think, as you rightly said, there's been this very, very bitter contestation between what is popularly known as the Nehruvian consensus to what is happening today. I think Mr. Nehru was it's product of his time, so there was also the time when a new nation was being born out of the bloodbath of partition and all the other problems that emerged with it. But in the process, I think there was a deep rupture with the past. He was willing, I think, to make a new India that had at best, a very tenuous relationship with the past, where the past was great to be seen as a fossilized museum piece, but never as a living tradition in most cases. I think the flashpoint, and if we discuss that in the context of what happened in Ayodhya last month, is the flashpoint of Somnath, where I think, in my view, Nehru would have been very happy to have given up the temple to ASI to have it renovated as a museum piece rather than as a living tradition. And he had this constant feud with the then president, Dr. Rajendra Prasad or K.M. Munshi, saying, I'm very, very worried about Hindu revivalism and what it would do to my image of my government, both inside India and outside India. So this preponderance, as this predilection with your secular credentials, so to say, almost meant that the largest community in the country had to tone down its appearance. Every other community in the country had the right to, wear its identity on its sleeve. But somehow, if a Hindu even mentioned it with a little more, assertion, was seen as a communal and a bigoted kind of an expression. Now, when we talk of identity, the basic moorings and the underpinnings, whether we like it or not, is not necessarily in the theological and in the religious sense, but in the cultural sense, our identity certainly has a lot of predominance of Hindu, culture. So to distance that and make that rupture from the past, I think that is where all the schisms come. And today, while we are forging ahead on all the other fronts, whether it's economy or in the military front, the social schisms and the social trouble we are seeing are all battles of the past, where history becomes such a live battlefield. We are constantly thinking of renaming cities, renaming towns. We have not made, peace with our past. There's been subterfuge, there's been whitewashing, the past. And as a result, these conflicts keep coming, and that in turn defines what I think the narrative becomes. And look at the way, we've also called ourselves a secular nation, but we are the only country where only the majority community, the Hindu community, is not allowed to own its own temples, its own places of worship. We can't have run our own educational institutions. If secularism means separation of church and state, the state or the government has no business running temples. I come from Karnataka, where in the recent budget, you had 300 crores for the Waqf properties, you had 200 crores for Christian institutions, and a 10% tax on Hindu temples, having a revenue of more than 1 crore. You can have non-Hindus on the board of trustees of Hindu temples. Will the converse also happen, where a Hindu or a Christian can be on the board of the Jama Masjid and so on? So I think there have been lots of such anomalies when it comes to our understanding, or this warped understanding of secularism, and that too has been a product of the Nehruvian era. And I use Nehruvian as a euphemism and not as a personal, attack on Mr. Nehru or his policy, but it's been a continued policy which has influenced our internal dynamics, our academia, our media, the way we look at history, the way we look at, culture, all of that. And there is a rupture where, as Mr. Khurshid rightly said, there has to be a counter, narrative. And so far, that counter narrative has been quite ruthlessly suppressed. There has been no power for that to express itself. Whether it's in academics, whether it's in media, people have paid a very heavy price, for forcefully putting forth their viewpoint. Now, to use Nehru's own terms, the soul of a nation long suppressed is finally finding utterance. And so this fight between India and Bharat, where does the soul of this nation rest? Are they the same? Are they different? Is it India that is Bharat, which means Bharat was the original entity and India was another version of that? All these contestations, and I think they are very healthy contestations, are finally happening, which was not happening so far in the last 70 years.
Okay, very well put. Salvador, my question to you is that India has a colonial past. We have inherited colonial histories. We have inherited colonial methods of reading and writing, which is like, not my words, in the words of Michel Foucault, an archaeology of knowledge, which is a privileged knowledge. Then you have less privileged knowledge. Then you have the subaltern knowledge, the layers of knowledge. So how do we wrest back our story from colonial writing, from colonial framing of Bharat, Bharatvash, India, in which she was exotic, she timeless, changeless, where the real India lived in villages, not in cities.
You don't have to take it back. Look, the debate over the nature of India is not a debate between Bharatis and colonists. It's a debate among Indians, and it's one for Indians to work out for themselves. It's true that this identity debate has become a fault line in Indian politics, but that's not particularly distinctive. It's a fault line in American politics. Talk to some Americans, and American is a slave country based on institutional racism, and their opponents are white supremacists. My own president, Joe Biden, literally said last year that elections in Republican states would be no better than elections in the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. And then he said, and I mean that literally. Of course, his opponent, Donald Trump, says that elections in Democratic-controlled states are completely meaningless because of ballot box stuffing and fake votes. Yet, in America, we have these debates, and no one questions American democracy. In Australia, we have these debates over the nature of the Australian nation, but there's no question about Australian democracy. In New Zealand, there's a huge debate about settler colonialism versus Maori conceptions of the nation. And there are no questions about Maori or about a New Zealand democracy. I hope we can lay to rest these questions about Indian democracy, because these are Indian questions. It's not a matter of colonialism, it's a matter of today.
Okay. Mini, what tools are required to tell the India story? More Indian writers writing about India, or more writers in India writing in the Indian/Bharatiya idiom?
Well, you spoke about soft power. And of course, you know, for a developed nation, and for a nation, any nation to be taken seriously in the international arena, it has to be strong military and economy and other things. But of course, soft power, the power of words, literature, and most, actually, interestingly, political parties or ideologies have, you know, come about from books and thought and words written by other people. So I think books do play a very important role. In Penguin, we like to publish everything that, you know, as a team we believe in. So I have two writers here, both Vikram and Salman Saab, and we publish their books. And that is just one form, I think, but it has a very wide reach, like I was saying earlier. So in a country as diverse as India, you know, and different states, languages, these days, even publishing and books in regional languages are very important, have caught on. So I think it does play a huge role. It has an impact. And it is another tool. Audiobooks, e-books in terms of publishing are also catching on, and other forms of, you know, writers to write and express themselves. So it's very important in democracy, I feel. You might agree, you might disagree, but everyone should have the freedom to express themselves, have opinions. You can debate and disagree, but you should be able to express yourself freely.
But I'm sure that there is a difference between multiplicity of opinions and a narrative. Like, for example, the American narrative. As a child, when I grew up in the 80s, the films I saw, like The Platoon, I thought that the Americans were the victims, you know, not the Vietnamese forces. So, you know, it's about building that narrative. Or the American films in South America, you know, I thought Americans were doing the good, you know, they're the good guys, going against the drugs. But I did not realize that they're breaking the state because the ruler didn't suit them. Quickly, I'll go through 4 questions because I'm falling short of time, and this is for you, Vikram. You know, when we talk about Bharatiya idiom, Jaishankar has recently spoken about it. He says that, you know, we'll talk about Waterloo, Pearl Harbor, Pyrrhic victory, but we will not talk about Awadh syndrome, Panipat movement, Lochit Boruphukan turn of events, or Somnath sacking. I mean, to say, there is an India context to the way you imagine history. If you say Waterloo, that's the Western context of imagining histories. It's like people playing football and, you know, children saying, Waterloo ho gaya.
No, that's so true. And I think when it comes to history also, we would have the idioms of certainly all the long list of battles we lost. Because we've been kind of, I think, dinned in our heads that we are nation of losers. Right from the myth of that Aryan invasion theory myth, we've almost been made to believe that we were destined, and this was a colonial project. We were made to believe that you're destined to be ruled by people from the outside, and it's only someone from the outside will come and give you culture, give you your languages, your earliest scriptures, and the language also was given by, you know, the people who came down the steppes. All these myths that were circulated by the colonial project to say that we, the British, are only a software update, so to say, you know, we're just version 2.0, and we always believed in the karma theory. Okay, it's our destiny to be ruled by others, so let's quietly accept this. And I think this was perpetuated. Sadly, what the British did, they did. But post-independence, I think we had a golden opportunity to correct that and create that grand India narrative. You spoke of the America's narrative. You have the American exceptionalism, or even China, which talks of a civilizational narrative as a closest neighbor when it comes to civilization that way. We did not develop that. We continued to probably add a little more layers where we look at ourselves and our past with a sense of apologia, almost looking at ourselves with a sense of inferiority complex, only harping on the negatives all the time. Every society has positives and negatives, but we would only talk about the negatives. We would not talk about Lachit Borphukan. The Battle of Sarai Ghat will not strike a bell. The Battle of Kolachal, where Martanda Varma defeated the Dutch East India Company, or Rani Abbakka, who defeated the Portuguese, or Rani Naiki Devi, who defeated Muhammad Ghori in the Battle of Kasarhada. Those will not strike a bell in the minds of any young Indian, whereas all of us would know about the Arab invasion and Muhammad bin Qasim, the battles of Panipat, the Anglo-Mysore, Anglo-Maratha, Anglo-Sikh, every war where we lost as a civilization. So I think that is a deep, and this is the soft part, the operating system. If that is faulty, then your hardware, how much ever good, I don't know how far it can go and for how long.
Salvatore, the human rights, it's a stick to beat various states. Americans get away by breaking Syria, and you have and they'll say there's a freedom movement there. They've broken Iraq. They have interventions everywhere in Northern Africa. But rights issue gets weaponized against India. You have an issue, and it becomes a human rights problem. What's the way out? How do we set our record straight there?
It's a problem for India because people know very little about India. I mentioned all those complaints about the United States, yet all of you have an independent viewpoint about the United States that does not depend on all the things you hear in the media. Similarly, India has a problem, especially with international human rights organizations. They are, and I'm sorry to say this, in many ways dominated by Islamists. They've been targeted by Islamists for the purpose of criticizing Israel, but the secondary purpose has become criticizing India. Now, I want to be clear, I'm using the word Islamists, not the word Muslims, right? Those same human rights organizations do good work criticizing human rights in Muslim-majority countries. They do very good work. But when it comes to Israel or India, there's a special disapprobation that's involved. Now, that wouldn't matter. It wouldn't matter at all if people in the rest of the world felt they had a strong understanding of India. The problem is the rest of the world doesn't know India. And until it does, these kinds of misrepresentations will dominate the discourse.
Mili, would you agree to that?
Well,
in terms of writing, publication, when the books come out?
Well, I think you see a narrative, the different narratives being created in social media, I think, has a very important role because people are on their phones all the time, and you see there's deep fake, right? There are fake videos, there is a certain narrative being created. And I think for a country like India, which is going through a churn, a lot of younger people, there will be changes, there is a transformation happening, and some of which other countries might like and might not like. So I think there is a bit of that.
You can address the issue suo-moto, but I have a question for you, sir. As the foreign minister, in last 2.5 years, during your tenure, the issue of Panun and Nijar, which we have witnessed, our terrorist becomes the freedom fighter there. We have tried our best to convince that they should not be hosted in Americas, or they should not be given that space and name of descent to say in Australia, to deface Indian high commissions. As an external affairs minister, how big was this challenge? Because it's really about the narrative, the India narrative, to treat Panun or Nijjar as just individuals and not those who are fomenting violence in this country.
All right, 2 quick points. One is only a point of perspective. I've agreed that there has to be a narrative versus narrative in a democracy. And there will be a large number of reasons why at a given time one narrative will prevail over another narrative. The point really is that in a democracy, you don't, and if they have an objection, I think that objection should be scrutinized and looked at carefully when you're assessing narratives. But I don't think that one narrative in a democracy has a right to exclude another narrative entirely. That's one backdrop point. The other backdrop point is, and I think this is not something that you would resolve here now, is the Indian nation. The Indian nation is not just the ancient Indian nation. You can't just write off the period which is called the medieval period or the Mughal period. You can't write off and say that was an aberration and those guys are not supposed to be here. The United States of America had blacks because blacks were brought into America. And they have South Asians because South Asians were allowed into the United States. And today they have a vice president who is a South Asian, right? I can't see easily someone becoming an MP coming from the United States of America becoming an MP. But that's because the local conditions don't allow it. If we aspire to something of that nature, we can work on it. That's not a problem. But describing the Indian nation cannot be a fundamental dispute between us, because if we have a fundamental dispute about what is the Indian nation, then you can't tell the world that there is no Indian nation. We are still arguing about whether we're an Indian nation. So it's like going to America at the time of the Civil War and saying, what is America? Right? And so they say, well, wait till the Civil War is over. Now, we don't want a Civil War here. And so clearly, if we don't want a Civil War here, we can't wait for the Civil War to be over. But your question about, our having felt upset, and we have good reason to feel upset, if somebody who's hurting us, whether it was next door who was hurting us and America continued to support them on a variety of reasons, or it was somebody who traveled from the Indian subcontinent to America or to Europe, who was hurting us here and continued to hurt us from there, we certainly had to say, look, this is not acceptable. But their democratic standards may be different. I don't think we would have allowed Karl Marx to come and write his treatise here in India, but England allowed Karl Marx to come when Karl Marx was questioning the very basic system of capitalization that they had, of capitalism that they followed. So our concern that we are hurt by these people must be something to which they are sensitive. And the element of what they can do to contain those people, in many cases, they've agreed with us and sent people back. In many states, in many cases, people wanted to come back, Khalistanis who wanted to come back, and we kept objecting that they shouldn't come back. Finally, we made peace with many of the Khalistanis and we let them come back. So these are things that they don't have a straitjacket for, but our concern, I think we can all agree upon. Our concern that people who hurt us must not be allowed to prosper.
Sure. I have run short of time, but I'll give 30 seconds Vikram and 30 seconds to you, Salvatore. 30 seconds each. I'll start with Vikram.
Okay. No, I completely agree with Mr. Khurshid on the first part, where, in Karnataka, when there was a BJP government, there were claims that, you should remove the chapters on Tipu Sultan and all that. That is a foolish attempt. And to take something away from your history books just because you don't like somebody or something, that is extremely foolish. I think what is the problem is, do you valorize invaders and barbarians? Now, our greatest universities, Takshila, Nalanda, Vikramshila, all of them being burnt, the Princetons and Harvards and Stanfords of this country, Bakhtiyar Khilji goes and ransacks Nalanda, and the manuscripts they said to have burnt for 6 months. And you come out of Nalanda today, the town there is called Bakhtiyarpur. Now, which other country in this whole world will actually valorize and make a hero of someone who ransacked your best university? Now, that is the problem. Don't delete anything. The good, bad, and the ugly needs to be known, but don't valorize these people for contemporary politics and appeasement and all these other things.
Salvatore, 30 seconds.
India has a 10,000-year history, and obviously it must engage with that entire history. But I'm very curious, sir, what was your experience in working with international human rights organizations when you were in office?
Well, we thought that they were, at times, they were unreasonable. At times, they were unwilling to understand what we were saying, and they didn't understand, sadly, they didn't understand till 9/11 happened.
Yes.
After 9/11, they began to understand. So when it first hurt them, when they first heard them, they understood that we were being hurt a long time. But the point is, will this be repeated? Will we hurt somebody and won't then show remorse till such time as somebody hurts us? I think this business of hurting each other, both here within the country and outside the country, must stop.
Okay.
There is something happening today in Gaza. There's something happening in Gaza that I think is immensely shameful for all humanity. But that's not to say that we are against Israel. Right? What happened to Israel was terrible. It was terrible what happened to Israel. But how far can Israel go?
Okay.
How far can it go is a big question.
Okay. I think we had a very fruitful discussion without letting it turn into another civil war. But I think we have set the record straight on most of the issues. And I think the bottom line here is, in many areas, India has tried to set the record straight. And in many areas, India has set the record straight. Thank you, all of you. Thank you, all of you.
We've just agreed to disagree.
I think that's fine. Yeah, I think that's fine.
All right, ladies and gentlemen,
let me just be very clear about one thing. There is scope for discourse and dialogue, and for people like Vikram Sampath to be upfront will make that dialogue possible. There are many people I could name who would not allow the dialogue.
All right, I think that deserves a round of applause. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you, Kartikeya, for that brilliant session. It's unending because we would like to hear them all the more, but unfortunately,
even
in the interest of time, let's move on. And
even as the photo ops continue, ladies and gentlemen.
Remember, we are talking about India's growth trajectory, and the sustenance of momentum becomes ever so crucial. This means nurturing growth while also ensuring that our economy remains steadfast on the path of progress. And as we navigate through this upcoming discourse, the aim is to unravel strategies for maintaining the current pace of development and fostering an environment which is conducive to sustained economic growth.